The echo of my own son calling me, "Old pig," filled the doorway as I stepped out of the house I helped him buy. Still, I steadied my breath, letting the sting of those words settle like dust on my skin. As the silence thickened, it pressed against the years I spent trying to keep our father-son bond alive. While that weight lingered, I finally understood he'd stopped seeing me as a father long before he said it. The same cold night made it clear that love without respect is nothing but quiet suffering. That's when I walked away, knowing life would show him what a father's absence truly costs. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The restaurant had the kind of warm lighting Greg always liked. Soft amber bulbs hanging low over polished wooden tables, a glow that made everything look gentler than it really was. He'd chosen this place carefully, wanting the night to feel special, memorable, maybe even healing. For weeks, he'd been searching for some way to bridge the growing distance between him and Jimmy, and tonight felt like the right moment. As the waiter set down their plates, Greg lifted his glass with a proud, almost boyish smile. "I've decided," he said, pausing for effect. "I'm going to help you buy that house in Orange County, the one we looked at." For a split second, Greg caught something flicker in Jimmy's eyes. Not excitement, not gratitude, but something closer to discomfort. Jimmy looked down at his plate, poking at the vegetables with a tense jaw. "Dad, I don't know if that's a good idea," he muttered. His tone wasn't humble or appreciative. It was stiff, hesitant, almost irritated. Samantha shot their son a quiet look, hoping to soften him, but Jimmy barely glanced up. Greg forced a light chuckle, trying to brush off the awkwardness. "What do you mean? It's a good neighborhood, a smart investment, and you deserve it, son." He spoke with genuine intention, thinking that if he said it confidently enough, the sentiment might break through whatever wall Jimmy had built between them. He'd spent most of Jimmy's life providing school, sports, grad school, loan help, believing that success and security were forms of love. Surely this house would show that too. But Jimmy shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders tight, the muscles around his mouth twitching with something unsaid. "It just feels like a lot," he replied. "I don't want people thinking I can't stand on my own." His voice trembled slightly, not with humility but resentment. Greg didn't notice the warning signs. He only heard his son's reluctance and mistook it for insecurity. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Let me do this for you. It'll help you start your life on solid ground. I want that for you." Across the table, Samantha watched the exchange with a sinking feeling. She knew Greg meant well, but she also saw the tension in Jimmy's posture, the way he recoiled every time his father spoke. She opened her mouth once, then closed it again. This wasn't the moment. She de-learned, over years of being married to a man who expressed love financially, and raising a son who felt smothered by it, that some truths only made things worse when spoken too early. The next few days moved quickly. Greg threw himself into the house purchase with triumphant energy, signing documents, transferring funds, negotiating repairs like he was building a shared future for both of them. He walked through the empty rooms, imagining Jimmy's life unfolding there. Holidays around the fireplace, cookouts in the backyard, late-night talks that might finally rebuild what they'd lost. Every step of the process made Greg feel like he was doing the right thing, the fatherly thing. He didn't see how often Jimmy's jaw clenched when Greg spoke to the contractor, or how his son stepped outside during discussions, pacing, frustrated, his phone gripped tightly in his hand. What Greg read as fatherly guidance, Jimmy experienced as intrusion. He felt watched, judged, controlled, like the house wasn't really his, just another extension of Greg's influence. And the more Greg tried to help, the more Jimmy recoiled, fighting a silent war between dependency and resentment. One afternoon, as a final detail of the mortgage paperwork was being settled, Jimmy finally snapped. Greg didn't hear the rage in his son's voice at first. His phone vibrated. He answered casually, expecting another routine question. But Jimmy's tone came through sharp, brittle, already past the point of reason. "You don't have to come over anymore," Jimmy said flatly. Greg blinked, confused. "What are you talking about? We still need to." I said don't come. Jimmy's voice was tight now, dripping resentment. Once this stupid deal is done, just get out. You hear me? Greg froze in the hallway of his office, heart hammering. Get out of my house. I don't need you breathing down my neck like some old pie. Gee. For a moment, Greg couldn't even process the words. Old pig, he whispered, the phrase slicing deeper than Jimmy could have known. The line crackled with static, but Jimmy didn't soften, not even a breath of regret. Yeah, you heard me, just stay out. The call ended with a dead click, leaving Greg standing there, speechless, hollowed, trying to catch up to the cruelty he just heard. And somewhere inside him, something small, something fatherly, something hopeful, quietly cracked, signaling that this was only the beginning of a much deeper unraveling. The sun was still hanging low when Greg pulled up to Jimmy's new house. Fresh paint, new landscaping, a shiny brass number plate, it all looked like the beginning of something hopeful. Greg stepped out of his car carrying a small toolbox, thinking he'd help with a few loose ends around the place. It had been a rough few days since that phone call, but he convinced himself Jimmy had just spoken out of stress. Fathers and sons clash, he told himself. This was normal. It would pass. But the second Jimmy opened the front door, Greg knew he had misread everything. Jimmy stood there with a stiff jaw, his eyes sharp and cold, like whatever warmth he used to reserve for his father had evaporated completely. "Why are you here?" he snapped. No greeting, no thanks, just hostility hanging in the doorway like smoke. Greg blinked, holding up the toolbox awkwardly. "I thought I'd help you set up the—" "I told you to stay out," Jimmy cut in, voice rising. "I don't want you here. I don't want you in my house." Greg tried to stay calm, tried to steady himself, but Jimmy's anger was already spiraling. "You think you can just buy me a house and control my life? You think throwing money at me gives you the right to run everything? You're suffocating me. You're—" his voice cracked with bitterness. "You're an old pig who doesn't know when to stop meddling." The words hit harder in person. They weren't shouted across a phone line this time. They were delivered face to face, sharp as glass. Greg felt something inside him go still, like the air had been punched out of his chest. "Jim, I'm trying to help you," he whispered, stunned. "I thought this was what you wanted." "What I want," Jimmy snapped, stepping forward, "is for you to leave. Right now." Greg stared at him, searching for some trace of the little boy he used to carry on his shoulders, the teenager he had supported through every failure, every struggle. But all he could see was resentment, hatred even, simmering just beneath the surface. So he left. He walked back to his car slowly, each step heavier than the last. He didn't slam the door, didn't yell back. He simply sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what just happened. He thought the house was a gift, a gesture of love, but clearly to Jimmy it was something else entirely, something twisted. When Greg finally made it home, Samantha came rushing toward him, already sensing something was wrong. "Greg, what happened?" Her voice was soft, worried, the way it always was when she sensed a storm inside him. He shook his head, unable to trust his voice. She pressed again, and when she finally coaxed it out of him, the story came in broken pieces. Jimmy's rage, the insult, the demand that he leave. Samantha's face fell. She wasn't shocked exactly, but deeply saddened. "Greg, he's overwhelmed. He doesn't handle pressure well. Maybe he didn't mean." But Greg pulled away. No, he meant every word. He wasn't angry, he was wounded. A deep, private hurt that he didn't want to unwrap in front of her. Instead, he walked to the den and sat alone, feeling the silence close over him like a heavy blanket. Meanwhile, in the empty echo of the new house, Jimmy paced in circles, unloading his frustration onto Samantha over the phone. "He doesn't get it, Mom. He never has. Every decision I make, he's right there breathing down my neck. I can't live like that." "He helped you buy the house," she reminded softly. "And I'm grateful," Jimmy snapped back, "but it doesn't give him the right to own my life. He's everywhere. He's in everything. I can't breathe without feeling him judging me." Samantha listened quietly, the way she often had to when both men were too proud to meet each other halfway. She heard the pain in her son's voice, the exhaustion, the resentment, but she also knew how deeply Greg had wanted to fix things. Back home, Greg sat under the dim lamp, wrestling with thoughts he didn't want to face. Had he been controlling? Had he pushed too hard? Or was Jimmy simply ungrateful, unwilling to acknowledge everything his father had done for him? The questions circled him like vultures, picking at every insecurity he'd buried over the years. His head felt heavy, so he stepped outside for a walk. The evening breeze was cool, but his chest still burned with the sting of Jimmy's words. Old pig. They echoed louder with every step he took down the quiet suburban street. He felt rejected, dismissed, and suddenly very alone. He had given his son everything, years of sacrifice, hard work, generosity, and somehow it still wasn't enough. By the time he returned home, Samantha was waiting on the porch, arms folded gently. "Greg," she said softly, "you need to understand, this could be the start of something worse if you don't deal with it now." But Greg shook his head, refusing to look at her. "Jimmy just needs time," he murmured. "He'll calm down." Samantha didn't try to argue, but her eyes said everything. And as Greg stepped inside, the weight of her unspoken warning settled over him like a shadow, one he didn't yet realize would only grow darker in the days ahead. The days that followed drifted by with a strange, heavy quiet. Greg carried the memory of that confrontation like a bruise, one he kept pressing on, testing the pain, hoping it would fade. But it didn't. Every morning he half expected Jimmy to call, to apologize, to take back the cruel words he'd thrown. Instead, there was nothing. No messages, no missed calls, just a silence that felt louder than the argument itself. Greg tried convincing himself this was normal, that sons get angry, say things they do mean, and eventually circle back. But even as he made excuses, the tension between them hung in the air like humidity before a storm. He found himself checking his phone more often than he wanted to admit, hoping to see Jimmy's name flashing on the screen. It never did. The longer the silence stretched, the more Greg's certainty began to crumble. At first he clung to indignation. "After everything I've done for him," he repeated in his mind. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Samantha had already gone to bed, a different voice started whispering through the cracks of his pride. "Maybe you pushed too hard. Maybe the house was more about you than him." He didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't ignore it either. Greg would sit alone in the living room, replaying every interaction from the past few months. The house hunt, the paperwork, the constant suggestions, instructions, gentle corrections he had offered like they were harmless. He'd convinced himself it was love, but now he wondered if it had felt like pressure to Jimmy, pressure disguised as generosity. Still, Greg reached out. A text one evening, "Hey Jimmy, just checking on you." No response. A voicemail the next morning, "Jim, call me back, okay? Let's talk." Silence. An email a few days later, "We should clear the air. I'm here whenever you're ready." Nothing. Jimmy's silence was complete, almost deliberate, and every unanswered message carved another wound in Greg's chest. Samantha noticed long before Greg admitted it. She saw how often he checked his phone, how his shoulders dipped when he didn't find anything, how distant he became, replaying conversations with a haunted look. One evening, while they were cleaning up after dinner, she set a hand on his arm. "Greg, he's not reaching out. This isn't just a mood. You two need to talk." Greg shook his head too quickly. "He just needs time," he insisted. "Jimmy's always been stubborn. He'll come around." But Samantha's worry deepened. She knew both her husband and son well enough to see the danger. They were mirrors of each other, both proud, both emotionally clumsy, both waiting for the other to make the first move. And pride could turn a small crack into a deep chasm before anyone realized what had happened. The tension only worsened when Rachel called. Greg hadn't spoken to her in a while, another strained relationship he hadn't quite known how to fix. She checked in with the warmth Jimmy lacked, asking how he'd been holding up since the fight. Greg shrugged it off. insisting he was fine, that Jimmy would eventually understand the intention behind the house. But Rachel didn't let it pass. Her voice softened. "Dad, maybe it's not just about the house. Maybe he needs you to show up emotionally, not financially. Jimmy's always wanted that from you." Greg bristled, even though a part of him knew she was right. "I'm doing everything I can," he muttered. "He's the one shutting me out." Rachel didn't argue, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any lecture she could have given. Later that week, Adam stopped by. His visits were rare these days, but when he heard about the situation, he insisted on coming over. They sat on the back patio, two old friends nursing cups of coffee as the late afternoon sun dipped low. Adam listened quietly as Greg explained the fallout, the silence, the confusion. When Greg finished, Adam leaned back with a sigh. "Greg, you've always tried to protect Jimmy by steering him, guiding him, but sometimes guiding feels like controlling, and sometimes controlling makes a kid feel like he can't breathe." Greg stiffened. "I wasn't controlling him, I was trying to help." "I know," Adam said gently, "but intention doesn't erase impact." That line lingered long after Adam left. That night, Greg sat alone in his office, staring at the half-finished glass of bourbon on his desk. He finally let the truth settle, calling, texting, pushing for reconciliation. None of it would work right now. Jimmy wasn't ready to hear from him. Maybe he needed space. Maybe Greg needed space too. For the first time since the fight, Greg didn't reach for his phone. He simply sat there, feeling the weight of his regrets and pride pressing down on him, understanding that the next move wasn't his to make. But as he turned off the light and headed down the hall, Samantha's earlier warning echoed in his mind, soft, worried, and painfully true. "Greg, this might be the beginning of a deeper rift." And for the first time, Greg felt a flicker of fear that she might be right. Greg wasn't expecting his phone to ring that morning. He'd grown used to the silence, the empty stretches of time where Jimmy's name didn't appear on the screen. So when his phone vibrated and he glanced down to see Jimmy, his breath caught somewhere between shock and dread. For a moment, he considered not answering, letting the call fade like all the unanswered ones he had sent. But something told him this wasn't a casual check-in. Something felt urgent. He pressed accept. Jimmy's voice came through strained, frayed at the edges. "Dad, I need to talk to you." Gone was the arrogance, the hostility, the simmering anger. What replaced it was panic, raw, unfiltered panic. Greg straightened instinctively, his heart thudding. "What's going on?" "It's the house," Jimmy said, the words rushed and uneven. "Something's wrong. No, a lot of things are wrong. I didn't know about the repairs. I didn't know the contractor filed a complaint. There's some kind of legal problem with the mortgage paperwork. I'm getting notices. I don't know what to do." His voice cracked and Greg heard fear there, real fear. The news hit Greg like cold water. He closed his eyes, imagining the home he'd proudly helped Jimmy secure now turning into a financial trap. "When did this start?" Greg asked quietly. "A few weeks ago," Jimmy admitted, shame dripping from each syllable. "I thought I could fix it. I thought I could handle it without you." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. For a long moment, Greg didn't speak. Part of him wanted to lash out, to remind Jimmy of the insults, the rejection. Another part, larger, older, instinctive, wanted to protect his son from drowning. But he also felt a new tension inside him, a boundary he hadn't had before. Helping blindly had cost him their relationship once. He wouldn't repeat the mistake. "Jimmy," Greg said slowly, "I'll help, but things can't be like before." The line went silent. Greg could hear Jimmy breathing, shaky, uneven. "What does that mean?" Jimmy whispered. "It means," Greg replied, choosing each word carefully, "I'm not coming in to fix everything while you stand back. You have to take responsibility. You have to be in this with me. I'll guide you, but I won't carry you." On the other end, Jimmy didn't argue. He didn't snap back. Instead, he exhaled a defeated, trembling sound. "Dad, I know I messed up. I know I pushed you away. I thought I was proving something, but I just made everything worse." His voice thinned. "I never learned how to handle things on my own, not really." The confession hit Greg harder than the insults ever had. There was no bitterness now, no pride. Just a young man realizing the gap between the life he wanted and the maturity he lacked. Greg felt something inside him soften, even as he held onto the boundary he'd just drawn. Still, the dilemma gnawed at him. Was helping the right choice? Was stepping back the right choice? He hated the idea of Jimmy sinking under a weight he didn't understand, but he also feared enabling him would lead them right back to the resentments that tore them apart. Greg rubbed his forehead. "Jimmy, I need some time to think." That sentence alone nearly broke his son. "Dad, please, I can't do this alone. I don't know who else to call." And that admission, "I called you because there's no one else," cut deeper than the earlier insults, because beneath it was something else, trust, a desperate, fragile trust. Samantha found Greg sitting at the edge of the bed afterward, shoulders tense, phone still in his hand. One look at his face and she knew Jimmy had reached out. "Talk to me," she said gently. He explained everything, the financial mess, the legal notices, the guilt, the confusion. Samantha listened, then placed a soft hand on his. "Greg, this might be the moment you've been waiting for. He's finally being honest, finally vulnerable. Don't let anger make the decision for you." "It's not anger," Greg murmured. "It's fear. If I help him again, will we end up back where we were? Will he resent me again?" Samantha squeezed his hand. "Not if you set boundaries this time. Help him learn, not rely." It was simple advice, but it cut through the fog he'd been stuck in. By late afternoon, Greg made his decision. He called Jimmy back, his voice steady, firm, but not cold. "I'll help you," he said, "but this time you follow my lead. You learn every step. You make the calls with me. You show up. No disappearing, no shutting me out." Jimmy didn't hesitate. "Yes, I will, I promise." Greg could hear the relief in his son's voice. Heavy, immediate, almost childlike. But behind that relief was something else forming. Something Greg hadn't felt from Jimmy in years. Respect. As Greg ended the call, he felt the weight shift inside him. They weren't healed. Not even close. But something had changed. Something small but significant, like the first crack of light under a long-closed door. And as he stood there, phone still warm in his hand, Greg knew this fragile moment could either rebuild everything or shatter under the pressure of what came next. Jimmy called again the next morning, but this time there was no frantic edge, no anger, no pride. His voice was flat, exhausted, defeated, like he'd spent the night wrestling with a problem that refused to loosen its grip. "Dad," he said quietly, "I need to tell you everything." Greg sat down on the edge of his bed, bracing himself. Jimmy took a shaky breath. "The house, it's worse than I thought. The contractor I hired, he disappeared after taking the deposit. Half the work wasn't inspected. There's mold in the walls. The roof is leaking. And the mortgage company says there's an issue with the original paperwork. They're threatening legal action if I don't fix it." Greg closed his eyes. He had known things were bad, but this was catastrophic. "Jimmy," he muttered, "how did it get this far without you telling me?" "I thought I could handle it," Jimmy said, voice cracking. "I thought pushing you away meant I had to prove I could stand on my own, but everything's just collapsing." Greg rubbed his forehead, frustration simmering underneath the concern. He felt it rising, hot and sharp. "Why didn't you check the contractor? Why didn't you read the paperwork? Why didn't you call me sooner?" But he swallowed it back. A blow-up wouldn't help either of them. He took a slow breath. "All right, tell me about the legal issues." Jimmy hesitated, then admitted, "There's a clause I didn't read. Something about contractor liens and unverified repairs. They say they can't finalize the mortgage unless I fix everything, and I don't have the money to do that." Greg felt the irritation tighten his chest. How had it reached this level of negligence? He wanted to yell, to shake sense into his son, to demand why he had been so reckless, but the sound of Jimmy's voice kept him steady. There was no arrogance now, no resentment, only fear. "I messed up," Jimmy whispered. "Dad, I really messed up." And finally, the part Greg had been waiting for, "I shouldn't have pushed you away. I was wrong." Hearing it didn't make the situation easier, but it did soften something inside him. Still, the conflict churned. He wanted to fix everything, step in, take control, clean up the mess like he'd done so many times before. But another part of him, the part that had been bruised and humiliated, hesitated. Helping again, deeply, financially, fully, could send Jimmy the message that he could always call for rescue, no matter how recklessly he acted, that Greg would always bear the fallout. Greg didn't want to build their relationship on dependency anymore. "Dad," Jimmy said again, more desperate this time, "please help me. I don't know where else to turn." Greg's silence stretched long enough that Jimmy's breath hitched on the other end. And still, the father inside him, the man who'd raised Jimmy, fought for him, sacrificed for him, felt torn down the middle. That was when Samantha stepped into the room, sensing the storm before hearing the details. She sat beside Greg and listened quietly as he explained the situation, the weight in his voice growing heavier with every word. When he finally finished, he leaned back, exhausted. "What am I supposed to do, Sam? If I fix it all, he learns nothing. If I don't, he drowns." Samantha placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Greg, this isn't just about the money or the repairs. This is about Jimmy finally understanding the consequences of his choices. But he came to you, not because he expects you to fix everything, but because he trusts you again. Don't throw that away. Don't let pride win." Her words sank deeper than she realized. Greg looked at her, really looked at her, and understood she was right. This moment wasn't about enabling Jimmy. It was about meeting him halfway, helping without controlling, guiding without taking over, teaching without punishing. That afternoon, Greg called Jimmy back. His tone was firm, steady, almost businesslike. "Jimmy, listen carefully. I'll help you, but only under one condition." "Anything?" Jimmy replied immediately. "You're going to handle the repairs. You're going to deal with the mortgage company. You're going to learn every step of this process. I'll guide you, I'll stand beside you, but I won't carry this for you. This is your house, your responsibility, your mess, so you'll take the lead." Jimmy didn't fight him. That alone was new. There was a beat of silence, then a quiet, "I understand. And thank you, Dad, really." Greg exhaled, a long, weary breath he'd been holding for weeks. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. But it was something like progress, or maybe the fragile beginning of it. And as he set the phone down, he felt the weight shift again. Not disappearing, not lightening entirely, but rearranging into something he could finally carry. Yet beneath that small relief was a deeper question, one he wasn't ready to answer. Was Jimmy truly ready to take responsibility? Or was this just the calm before a much bigger storm? Greg arrived at Jimmy's house early the next morning, a clipboard in one hand and a slow, cautious determination in the other. Stepping into the half-finished living room, he surveyed the scattered tools, exposed wiring, and sagging drywall. It was worse than he'd imagined. Still, he reminded himself of the promise he'd made. He would help, but he would not take over. Jimmy had to be part of this. He had to learn. Greg walked Jimmy through the repairs methodically, showing him which contractors to call, what paperwork needed to be filed with the city, and how to document expenses. Every instruction was measured, intentional. He kept using phrases like, "You'll handle this part," instead of "I'll take care of it." But even with this gentler approach, he sensed the tension brewing in the room. Jimmy followed behind him stiffly, arms crossed, jaw tight. Whenever Greg paused to explain something, Jimmy's expression flickered between embarrassment and resentment. "I know how to do that, Dad," he snapped at one point, though his hesitation only moments earlier made it clear he didn't. Greg swallowed the irritation rising in his throat. "I'm not doing it for you," he said patiently. "I'm showing you how to do it right." But Jimmy didn't hear the patience, he only heard the criticism. His pride had always been fragile, and now, facing a mess he'd created, every correction felt like a spotlight on his failures. When he tried making calls on his own, he stumbled. Misread documents, missed deadlines, misunderstood contractor language, and every mistake made him bristle more. By late afternoon, Samantha had stopped by with sandwiches. She found the two of them standing in the kitchen, both frustrated, both simmering. She quietly observed as Greg tried to walk Jimmy through the mortgage company's demands. Greg's tone was calm, almost rehearsed, but she could see the weariness in his eyes. Jimmy's responses were clipped, defensive, sometimes bordering on hostile. To Samantha, it was painfully clear. Greg's help, well-intentioned, thorough, was also reopening the wounds between them. His guidance came from love, but to Jimmy it felt like judgment. And every time Greg stepped in to fix something, Jimmy seemed to shrink further into that resentment. That evening, the tension finally broke. They were reviewing a repair estimate when Jimmy snatched the paper out of Greg's hand. "Stop micro. Managing everything," he snapped. "I can handle a damn estimate without you breathing down my neck." Greg stared at him, stunned. "I'm trying to keep you from making another mistake." "Maybe let me make them," Jimmy shot back. "You think you're helping, but all you're doing is proving I can't do anything without you." The words hit Greg harder than he expected. Something inside him, already cracked from weeks of strain, finally gave way. He set the papers down slowly, his voice tired rather than angry. "You know what, Jimmy? Fine, handle it. Handle all of it." Jimmy blinked, thrown off by his father's sudden stillness. But Greg didn't argue further. He simply gathered his things, nodded once, and stepped outside without another word. Samantha watched him leave, worry lining her face. She knew Greg wasn't walking away out of spite. He was walking away because he'd finally realized that stepping back might be the only way forward. Tough love wasn't natural for him. He had spent decades solving problems with money and involvement. But now, tough love felt necessary. Jimmy remained inside the house, pacing in circles, frustration giving way to something heavier, panic. The silence left behind in Greg's absence felt different this time. Not angry, not punishing, just empty. And emptiness had a way of forcing truths to the surface. Over the next several days, Jimmy tried handling everything on his own. It didn't go well at first. Contractors avoided his calls. The mortgage company demanded paperwork he didn't know how to fill out. Deadlines piled up. Repairs stalled. His frustration turned into anxiety, and the more he struggled, the more he realized how much he had depended on his father, not just for money, but for structure, for direction, for stability. One night, after hours of attempting to decipher legal documents, Jimmy sat alone in the half-repaired living room, surrounded by dust and silence. For the first time, instead of blaming Greg or blaming circumstances, he blamed himself. He had pushed away the one person who knew how to handle situations like this, and now he was paying the price. But slowly, something in him shifted. He began taking notes when contractors called. He made organized lists instead of frantic scribbles. He reread documents until they made sense. And with every small step, he felt a faint but growing sense of control, ownership of the mess he'd created and responsibility for fixing it. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't smooth, but it was progress. And as Greg lay awake at night, wondering whether stepping back had been the right choice, he had no idea that Jimmy, frustrated, humbled, exhausted, was finally beginning to grow in the very space Greg had reluctantly given him. Whether that growth would last, or collapse under pressure, remained an unanswered question hovering over both father and son. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. After Greg stepped back, he expected Jimmy to call, maybe not to apologize, but at least to ask a question, request clarification, something. Instead, nothing came. The silence stretched thin, and with every passing day the distance between them widened like a slow, steady crack in glass. Jimmy, meanwhile, threw himself into managing the repairs on his own. Greg knew this not because Jimmy updated him, but because the few times he drove by the house, more out of worry than curiosity, he saw Jimmy in work gloves, pacing with a clipboard or on the phone with a contractor. Jimmy avoided looking at him when he happened to catch sight of Greg's car. He kept his head down, determined not to appear dependent. Greg understood the pride behind it, even if it stung. Still, part of Greg felt a small, reluctant swell of pride. Jimmy was trying. For the first time, Greg saw his son handling responsibility without being pushed or guided. But right beneath that pride was something heavier: sadness. Watching Jimmy struggle alone wasn't easy. Each time Greg saw the frustration in Jimmy's stiff movements or heard the strain in his voice from a distance, he felt an urge to step in. Fix it. Solve it. Make the pain go away. But he stayed back, hands tied by the promise he'd made and the fragile progress they were trying to build. Samantha noticed the shift immediately. Greg grew quieter, restless. He lingered at windows, paused mid-task, stared at his phone without unlocking it. One evening, while he stood by the kitchen counter pretending to read emails, she gently pressed a hand to his back. "You miss him," she whispered. Greg didn't respond at first. He just breathed out slowly. "I'm giving him space," he said, though it sounded more like a question than a conviction. "Space is good," Samantha agreed softly, "but not distance, not silence, not when things are already fragile." She paused. "Greg, you two could lose each other for good if you don't reach out." Her words landed deep, too deep. Greg swallowed hard and nodded, but he didn't act. Pride, fear, uncertainty, they all gled inside him, holding him frozen in place. At the same time, Jimmy was wrestling with his own battle. Every night, after hours of scraping mold, calling inspectors, reviewing invoices, he'd collapse onto a folding chair he'd set up in the unfinished living room. And in the stillness, he found himself thinking about Greg, not with anger this time, but with a dawning understanding he hadn't allowed himself before. He replayed old moments. Greg arguing with contractors on his behalf when he was a teenager, Greg bailing him out of debts in college, Greg offering guidance he had always dismissed as interference. For years, Jimmy told himself his father's involvement was control. But now, knee-deep in responsibilities he barely understood, he finally saw the truth. Greg wasn't trying to puppeteer him. Greg was trying to protect him in the only way he knew how. Jimmy realized something else too. Greg had stepped back only because Jimmy demanded it. The space wasn't punishment, it was respect. And the ache in Jimmy's chest grew heavier as he realized how much he'd taken for granted. Meanwhile, Greg continued pacing the emotional line between pride and worry. At work, he found it difficult to focus. At home, Samantha watched him with concerned eyes. At night, sleep came slow, his mind echoing with questions he tried to ignore. Was I too hard on him? Did I push too far? Did I step back too quickly? Is he struggling because of me or because he needs to? The confusion gnawed at him. A few days later, Rachel drove down to visit. She hadn't seen Greg in weeks, but she took one look at him and saw the turmoil written across his face. Over coffee, she listened as Greg recounted everything. His attempt at balanced help, the argument, the silence, the distance that seemed to grow no matter what he did. Rachel leaned back, her expression softening. "Dad, you've always tried to show love through actions, money, solutions. You think fixing things equals caring." She shook her head gently. "But Jimmy needs something else. He needs you to talk to him not as a problem solver but as his father. He needs to know you see him, that you feel with him, not just for him." Greg stared into his mug, her words landing with a weight he couldn't dodge. That night he sat alone in his study, staring at a framed photo of Jimmy as a kid, grinning, missing a front tooth, clinging to Greg's leg. The memory hit hard because back then everything had felt simple. Back then, helping Jimmy had never been a question. It had been instinct. Now here he was, hesitating, questioning, overthinking every move. And in that stillness, something finally clicked. He realized he'd spent years using money as a placeholder for emotional closeness. He had patched over wounds with financial solutions, not conversations. And now, with the money stripped away, the emotional gap stood exposed, wide, raw, undeniable. Greg set the photo down slowly, a quiet heaviness settling over him. If their relationship was going to survive, he couldn't rely on his wallet anymore. He would have to face the part he'd been avoiding, the emotional truth he had never dared to confront. And as he sat there in the dark, he felt the gravity of how much that reckoning might cost both of them. The call came on a quiet Wednesday evening, just as Greg was settling onto the couch with a cup of coffee he wasn't really in the mood for. The house felt unusually still, the sort of stillness that made every sound echo a little longer. When his phone rang and Jimmy's name appeared on the screen, Greg froze. He stared at it as if the name itself might disappear if he blinked too hard. With a slow breath, he answered. Jimmy didn't speak at first. Greg could hear him breathing, like he was trying to gather the strength to step into unfamiliar territory. Finally, Jimmy exhaled shakily. "Dad, I need to talk to you." Greg braced himself, unsure whether he should expect anger, another argument, or a plea for help. But what he heard instead disarmed him completely. "I'm sorry," Jimmy said, not rushed, not defensive, just honest. Greg blinked, his fingers tightening around the mug. "What?" "I'm sorry, Dad," Jimmy's voice cracked. "For everything, for how I talked to you, for pushing you away, for calling you what I did." There was a long, weighted pause. "My anger, it wasn't about you. Not really. It was about me, about feeling like I wasn't enough, like I couldn't live up to what you expected. And instead of dealing with that, I lashed out at you." Greg didn't interrupt. He just listened, heart pounding at each admission. "I've been working on the house," Jimmy continued, "handling the calls, the repairs, the paperwork. And the more I took on, the more I realized how much you've carried for years, how much you've done for us. I thought you were trying to control me, but you were trying to protect me. I didn't see it. I didn't want to." His voice softened to almost a whisper. "I've grown up a lot these past weeks. And I know I hurt you. I'm sorry." The house felt too quiet. Greg closed his eyes, trying to swallow the sudden rush of emotion that tightened his throat. He had imagined this moment, some version of it, but he never expected it to sound so real, so vulnerable. "Jimmy," Greg finally said, his voice thick, "thank you for saying that." He rubbed his forehead, trying to steady himself. "I made mistakes too. I thought giving you money meant giving you love. I thought solving your problems meant being a good father." He shook his head. "I didn't know how to show you anything else." Jimmy was silent, but Greg sensed he was listening with a new kind of openness. "I wasn't trying to control you," Greg continued, "but I see now how it felt that way. I stepped in too quickly. I tried to fix things before giving you a chance to fall or learn or even try. I didn't trust you to handle life on your own." He breathed out, the confession heavy but necessary. "And that wasn't fair to you." Jimmy let out a small, trembling sigh. "Dad, I don't want to fight anymore." "Neither do I." Across the living room, Samantha stood quietly in the doorway, her hands clasped to her chest. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the tenderness in both their voices brought tears to her eyes. When Greg hung up, she walked to him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "You did good," she whispered. "Both of you. This is the beginning of something better." Greg rested his head against her shoulder, exhausted but hopeful. "I just want us to be a family again," he murmured. Later that evening, Rachel called. Somehow, she always sensed when something shifted in the family. When Greg told her about the conversation, she smiled softly through the phone. "Dad, this is your chance. Don't overthink it. Don't try to fix everything with your wallet. Jimmy needs you to show up emotionally. Tell him how you feel. Let him see the father you're trying to be now." Greg let her words sink in. "I've never been good at that," he admitted. "None of us are," Rachel replied gently, "but that's how healing starts." After the call, Greg sat with his thoughts. Samantha joined him, holding his hand without saying a word. He realized then that stepping back didn't mean withdrawing. It meant supporting Jimmy in ways that didn't overshadow him. The next morning, Greg drove to Jimmy's house. Not to lecture, Not to take charge, just to be there. He brought no toolbox, no paperwork, only a willingness to listen. Jimmy opened the door slowly, nerves etched across his face, but when he saw his father standing there without judgment, something softened in his eyes. They talked, not about money, not about repairs, but about everything they'd avoided for years. The words were imperfect, the emotions raw, but the sincerity was unmistakable. And for the first time, they weren't talking past each other. They were talking to each other. It wasn't a clean slate. It wasn't instant forgiveness, but it was a start. And as they stood on that fragile new bridge between them, both father and son sensed the same quiet truth. The real work was only beginning. The house was quieter than usual when Greg arrived that afternoon. The repairs were finally beginning to show progress: fresh drywall in the hallway, new fixtures stacked neatly in boxes, but there was still a heaviness in the air. He found Jimmy sitting on an overturned bucket in the living room, elbows on his knees, staring at the unfinished wall like it held answers to questions he hadn't yet formed. Greg approached slowly, not wanting to break whatever fragile piece existed in the moment. Jimmy didn't look up at first. He just breathed, slow and shaky, like he was bracing himself for a conversation he'd been avoiding his entire life. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, can I tell you something? And I need you not to interrupt. Just listen." Greg nodded, unsure where the conversation was headed but sensing its importance. Jimmy swallowed hard. "I've spent my whole life feeling like I couldn't measure up to you. Like every step I took, you were already 3 steps ahead, ready to tell me the right way to do it." His voice trembled slightly. "I always felt like if I made the wrong decision, you'd be disappointed. And that pressure, it got to me. I tried to act like I didn't care, like I didn't need your approval. But the truth is, I've been scared of letting you down since I was a kid." Greg's breath caught. He'd expected anger or blame, but not this. Not raw, exposed honesty. Jimmy wiped a hand over his face. "And when you helped me buy this house, I felt like I was proving your point, like I couldn't stand on my own. I got angry because I felt useless, not because of what you did, but because of what it made me feel about myself." Greg stepped closer, heart pounding with a tenderness he didn't know how to show. Jimmy continued, his voice cracking. "I didn't push you away because I hated you. I pushed you away because being around you made me feel like a failure. And instead of saying that, I attacked you. I hurt you, I know that." Greg knelt down beside him so they were eye to eye. "Jimmy," he said quietly, "I didn't know, I really didn't, but hearing you say this, it means more than you realize." He took a long breath, grappling with his own guilt. "I need to admit something too. I didn't know how to be the father you needed. I thought providing for you was enough. Money, advice, solutions, that's the only language I understood. I wasn't trying to control your life, I was trying to protect it." He paused, eyes softening. "But the truth is, I didn't know how to love you any other way." The room felt still, almost sacred, like these confessions were unearthing years of buried emotion neither had dared to acknowledge. Greg continued, voice rough. "Maybe I held on too tightly. Maybe I stepped in too quickly. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I didn't trust myself to let you fall." Jimmy's eyes shone with something fragile, recognition, maybe even forgiveness. At that moment, Samantha entered quietly. She paused when she saw them, sensing the shift in the air. Instead of backing out, she approached and sat with them, her presence warm and steady. "You too," she murmured, "have been carrying so much weight alone." She placed a hand on Greg's shoulder, then Jimmy's. "Love isn't about control or fixing everything, and it isn't about proving something. It's about patience, understanding, and being willing to show the parts of yourself that scare you." Neither man spoke, but both listened. Samantha continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to get everything right. You just have to show up for each other. That's all any family really needs." Silence settled again, comfortable this time, not suffocating. Greg reached out and placed a hand on Jimmy's back. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "Not because of the house or the repairs or any of that. I'm proud because you're trying, because you're growing, because you're facing things you used to run from." Jimmy lowered his head, blinking back emotion he didn't want to show but couldn't hide. "I appreciate you, Dad, more than I ever said." They sat together for a long moment, the air thick with unspoken understanding. The emotional walls between them, built from years of silence, assumptions, and unspoken expectations, finally began to crumble. Slowly, but undeniably. As the afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows, Jimmy leaned back and let out a long exhale. "I know we have a lot to fix between us," he said, "but I want to try. I want us to get better." Greg nodded, feeling the weight lift from his chest. "We will, one step at a time. No more hiding behind money, no more guessing what the other one feels." He paused. "We'll actually talk for once." Jimmy offered a small, tentative smile, one Greg hadn't seen in years. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't healed, but it was a beginning. Samantha watched them with quiet relief, knowing this moment, this vulnerable, unguarded moment, was the turning point they both needed. The road ahead was long, maybe even uncertain. But for the first time in years, father and son were standing at the same starting line, ready to move forward together. And both of them knew. The real healing had only just begun. Spring drifted slowly into early summer, and with it came a quieter rhythm between Greg and Jimmy, one built not on perfection but progress. Day by day, the sharp edges of their past softened, though they never fully vanished. They still had moments where tension cracked through the surface, where old habits tugged them backward. But unlike before, those moments no longer spiraled into explosions or silence. Instead, they paused, talked, and sometimes awkwardly found their way through. The house repairs moved forward steadily. Jimmy handled more phone calls, filed documents correctly, and even negotiated with a contractor who tried overcharging him. Greg stood by when needed, but more often he simply watched, letting Jimmy take the lead. It wasn't easy for him. He had spent decades stepping in before his son could stumble, but now he understood stumbling was part of growth. One afternoon, Greg found himself alone on the patio, staring out over the backyard as the sun dipped into a warm orange haze. He thought back over the years, moments where he'd tried to express love through money, where he'd offered checks instead of conversations, advice instead of empathy. He realized how many times he'd replaced emotional presence with problem solving. It had been easier that way, safer, less vulnerable. But now, after everything that had happened, he made himself a promise. No more hiding behind what he could provide. From now on, he would show up not as a fixer, but as a father. Jimmy, on his end, was experiencing his own transformation. He still struggled. Responsibility didn't come naturally to him, but he was learning. Bit by bit, he stopped reaching F. or Greg out of panic and started seeking him out for guidance instead. He began making decisions with more thought, taking ownership of both the victories and the consequences. There were nights where he sat alone in the unfinished living room, tools piled around him, and wondered how he had ever let things get so bad. But then he remembered the old version of himself, the one who ran from discomfort, who blamed everyone but himself, and he felt a flicker of pride that now, finally, he wasn't that man anymore. Samantha watched these changes with a kind of quiet relief that settled deeper each day. She had stood between Greg and Jimmy for years, trying to soothe arguments neither of them knew how to navigate. Now, she didn't have to mediate every moment. Instead, she nudged them forward gently when they slipped into old patterns, reminding Greg to listen more and Jimmy to breathe before reacting. Her presence became a soft anchor, grounding both men as they tried to reshape their dynamic. Rachel remained a steady voice from the sidelines. She didn't involve herself as much as Samantha, but she checked in with Jimmy and Greg separately, offering the same calm reminders whenever needed. Talk to each other, not around each other. Her insight had a way of cutting to the truth without stirring conflict, and both men found comfort in her balanced perspective. As weeks passed, Greg began to sense a new dynamic emerging, one he had once believed impossible. Jimmy no longer flinched at advice or bristled at guidance. Greg no longer assumed control at the slightest sign of trouble. Conversations became longer, more open. Laughter, something that had once come only in strained, forced bursts, started returning in moments that felt natural. The emotional vulnerability between them wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Greg didn't measure their bond by how much he could give. He measured it by how much they could say to each other without fear. One late evening, after a long day of work on the house, Greg and Jimmy sat on the front steps, cooling off under the dim porch light. The neighborhood was quiet, the air warm, and for a moment they simply breathed the same steady rhythm. Greg broke the silence first. "Jimmy, I want you to know something." His voice was gentle, stripped of the authority he'd always carried. "No matter what happens, no matter where you go, what choices you make, I'll always be here. Not with money, not with solutions, but as your father. That's what I should have been all along." Jimmy looked out at the street, blinking hard. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled with sincerity. "And I'll keep trying, Dad. I'm still learning, still figuring things out. But I want to be someone you're proud of. Not because you helped me get there, because I earned it." Greg turned to him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "You already have." Jimmy didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, the weight of the words settling into him like a promise he wasn't alone in keeping. Their relationship wasn't fixed, not fully, not yet, but it was changing, growing into something built on trust, respect, and emotional honesty. And as they sat there on that quiet summer night, both father and son sensed the same truth. Time alone couldn't heal what had been broken. But time, paired with willingness, just might be enough to build something new. The progress Greg and Jimmy had made over the past month was real, but fragile. It didn't take much for old habits, old fears, old wounds to slip through the cracks. And the moment the last major repairs were finished, the question neither of them wanted to face rose back to the surface. What now? One late afternoon, Jimmy stood in the backyard, staring at the house like it was a burden he'd been dragging uphill. The repairs were done, the legal issues sorted, the debt stabilized, but the weight remained. When Greg joined him outside, Jimmy didn't bother easing into the conversation. "Dad," he said with a tired exhale, "I don't think I can stay here." His eyes drifted over the roofline, the windows, the yard that had become a battlefield of personal growth and emotional scars. "It's too much. All of it. I'm drowning in responsibility I wasn't ready for." Greg stayed quiet, letting the words sit. Jimmy continued, hands pressed against his knees. "Sometimes I think taking your help was the mistake. If I had just done things on my own, maybe none of this would have happened." Greg felt the sting, but this time he didn't react defensively. "Jimmy," he said calmly, "you didn't make a mistake accepting my help. You made mistakes after, and so did I." He paused. "But if the house feels like too much, then maybe it's okay to let it go." Jimmy shot him a sharp look. "That easy for you to say. You don't have to live with the consequences. You don't have to feel like a failure every time you pull into the driveway." Greg lifted his brows, absorbing the blow. This wasn't anger directed at him. It was self-loathing misfiring outward. "Selling the house isn't failure," Greg replied. "But if you decide to do it, it has to be because you know it's the right choice, and you need to own it." Jimmy scoffed, frustration bubbling up again. "There it is, another lecture on responsibility." "No," Greg said, keeping his voice even. "This is me telling you that if the house is too heavy, you don't have to carry it forever. But don't blame the weight on me." That sentence, the quiet accountability in it, set Jimmy off. "You think you understand the pressure I'm under, Dad, but you don't. You've always been ahead of me. You've always had the answers. You're not the one who feels judged every time you mess up." Greg felt something old tight inside his chest, but Samantha's voice floated into the backyard before he could answer. "Enough." She stepped onto the patio with that soft authority she'd mastered over the years. "Both of you, this isn't about the house." Jimmy turned toward her, defenses flaring. "Mom." "No," she cut in, gentle but firm. "This is about how you two talk to each other. You default to pride, you default to blame, and none of that helps either of you." She looked from Jimmy to Greg. "If you're going to decide about the house, you need to do it without dragging old resentments into the mix." Greg exhaled slowly. Jimmy looked away. But the pause didn't dissolve the tension. It only made the silence sharper. After a moment, Greg spoke again. "Jimmy, you asked for honesty, so here it is." His voice softened. "I don't want you to keep the house because of me. I don't want you to sell it because of me either. But whichever choice you make, it needs to be yours, not your pride talking, not your fear." Jimmy's jaw tightened as he listened. "And what if I'm not ready to make a choice?" "Then say that," Greg replied. "Don't lash out. Don't turn me into the enemy just because you're overwhelmed." That struck deeper than either of them expected. For a long, thick moment, father and son held each other's gaze. Two men trying to grow out of patterns they'd practiced for years, but still falling back into without meaning to. The tension was palpable, a standoff unspoken but unmistakable. Jimmy looked back at the house, eyes heavy. "I can't keep living like this," he murmured. "Every hallway reminds me of a mistake. Every bill reminds me of how unprepared I was." Greg nodded slowly. "Then maybe letting go is part of the lesson." Jimmy inhaled sharply, thinking hard. Then finally, quietly, reluctantly, he said, "I'll sell it, but not yet. Not until I finish what I started. I want to understand the financial side. I want to close things out properly. I don't want to walk away the same person who walked in." Greg felt a tightness in his chest ease. "I respect that, I really do." Jimmy didn't look at him, but his shoulders dropped with relief. Small, subtle, real. They still weren't aligned perfectly. They still weren't healed. But the decision was a turning point, a small act of agency Jimmy needed and Greg knew not to interfere with. As the sun dipped behind the roofline and shadows spilled across the yard, both men stood quietly, absorbing the moment. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't closure. But it was movement. And where that movement would lead, neither of them fully knew yet. Jimmy began the process of selling the house the very next week. Unlike before, when Greg handled every detail, Jimmy took the first steps alone. He contacted a real estate agent, gathered documents, and started cleaning the place in preparation for showings. Greg watched from a distance, stepping in only when Jimmy asked for clarification. This time, he didn't rush to take the reins. He answered questions, explained procedures, and walked Jimmy through the legal and financial responsibilities without shielding him from them. It wasn't easy for Greg. Every instinct in him wanted to fix things, to smooth every complication before it ever reached Jimmy's hands. But he held himself back, allowing his son to experience the weight of adult responsibility, something he had once unintentionally protected him from. When Jimmy missed a detail on a disclosure form and had to redo several sections, Greg resisted the urge to key the pen and complete it himself. Instead, he leaned over the table and said quietly, "You've got this. Start again. I'm right here." Jimmy nodded, jaw set with determination. And for the first time, Greg saw something old and familiar in his son's eyes: drive. Not resentment, not insecurity, just effort. As the days passed, Jimmy made more decisions independently, choosing the listing price, arranging repairs the agent recommended, negotiating minor issues. Greg felt a strange mix of pride and worry swirling inside him. Pride because Jimmy was finally stepping into adulthood with both feet. Worry because he knew how overwhelming the process could be, and he feared Jimmy might crumple under the weight if things didn't go smoothly. One evening, while they reviewed paperwork on the kitchen table, Greg surprised even himself by opening up. "Jimmy," he said quietly, "I need you to know something. I worry a lot. Not because I think you can't handle things, but because I'm afraid of failing you. I've spent years trying to fix every problem before it reached you, And sometimes I think I did that because I didn't trust myself to be the kind of father you needed." Jimmy looked up, startled. Greg rarely spoke this candidly. Vulnerability didn't come naturally to him. It sat in his voice like a foreign weight. "I don't want you to feel controlled," Greg continued, "but I also don't want you to think I didn't believe in you. I just didn't know how to show love without trying to take care of everything." Jimmy sat back, the emotion in his father's voice disarming him. He put down the pen, rubbing the back of his neck. "Dad, I'm sorry for how I treated you, for saying the things I said. I was angry, but mostly I was scared. And instead of admitting that, I took it out on you." His voice wavered. "You didn't deserve that." Greg shook his head gently. "We both did things wrong. What matters is we're fixing it now." They worked for another hour without tension, something that would have felt impossible a month earlier. Greg commented only when Jimmy asked, and Jimmy no longer misinterpreted every suggestion as criticism. There was a steadiness between them, a shared sense of purpose neither had felt before. Samantha watched from the doorway, smiling softly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. For years, she'd carried the quiet burden of trying to hold them together, fearing the gulf between them might break wider. But now, seeing them collaborate with patience instead of pride, she felt a hope she hadn't dared embrace in a long time. Later that night, she squeezed Greg's hand and whispered, "You're becoming the father you always wanted to be." Greg didn't argue. The house went on the market within 2 weeks. The repairs had been completed, the paperwork finalized, and the listing photos captured. Jimmy waited nervously for offers, pacing the halls like a man bracing for judgment. When the first offer came, fair, reasonable, promising, he showed it to Greg with trembling hands. "You decide," Greg said, stepping back. Jimmy read it 3 times before nodding. "I'm ready." The closing process was tedious, but Jimmy stayed on top of it with a level of responsibility Greg hadn't seen in years. By the time the house officially sold, Jimmy wasn't celebrating, he was reflecting. Letting go of the house wasn't just a financial choice, it was symbolic. It was him choosing to move forward, not hide behind excuses or pride. After signing the final documents, Jimmy turned to Greg. "I don't know what's next," he admitted, "but for the first time, I want to figure it out myself." Greg placed a hand on his son's shoulder, steady and warm. "And I'll be here," he said, "not to steer you, not to fix things, but to walk beside you when you ask." Jimmy nodded, a quiet certainty settling in his eyes. The house was gone. The past could not be rewritten. But the future, still uncertain, still fragile, finally felt like something they were facing together, not against each other. And for Greg, that alone brought a peace he hadn't felt in years. The day after the sale closed, the house keys sat on the kitchen table in Greg's home, no longer symbols of stress or bitterness, but quiet reminders of how far he and Jimmy had come. The two of them sat across from each other, coffees in hand, the atmosphere softer than it had been in months. There was no rush, no tension, just a stillness that invited honesty. Jimmy cleared his throat first. "I don't know exactly what's next for me," he admitted, "but I feel different now, stronger. I actually feel like I can handle things." He didn't say it with arrogance or bravado. It was humility, growth. Greg saw it plainly, and something inside him eased. "That's what matters," Greg replied gently. "Not having all the answers, just knowing you can face whatever comes." He studied his son, not the frustrated, angry young man from months ago, but someone stepping into himself for the first time. That realization hit GR. For example, harder than he expected. As Jimmy spoke about possible jobs, new apartments, and future plans, Greg found himself drifting into reflection. The past months had pushed him deeper into self-awareness than any business negotiation or financial challenge ever had. He saw clearly now that all those years he called guidance had really been fear. Fear of losing Jimmy. Fear of not being needed. Fear that if he wasn't useful, he wasn't worthy. He had tried to love Jimmy by controlling outcomes, by preventing mistakes, by building walls of money around him. But now he understood. Control wasn't love. Control was fear wearing love's mask. That evening, Samantha decided a quiet celebration was overdue. She invited Rachel over, cooked a meal big enough for a holiday, and filled the table with warmth that the family hadn't shared in far too long. When Jimmy and Greg arrived in the dining room, the atmosphere felt different, lighter, steadier, almost normal. Rachel hugged Jimmy tightly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, "really proud." Jimmy offered a sheepish smile, while Greg watched the reunion with quiet gratitude. For the first time in a long time, the family sat together without tension thickening the air. There was laughter, real laughter, stories, even a few jokes about the nightmare contractors Jimmy had dealt with. Midway through dinner, Rachel, ever the observer, leaned back and said, "You two have changed, both of you." She motioned between Greg and Jimmy. "This wasn't easy to watch, but seeing where you are now, it's worth it." Jimmy chuckled under his breath, while Greg simply nodded, humbled. After dinner, Megan, their longtime family friend, arrived with a bottle of wine and her usual calm insight. She studied Jimmy and Greg with a warm smile. "You're both different, stronger, softer in the right ways," she said. "Healing hurts, but you did it anyway." Her words lingered, grounding the moment. Later, when the dishes were cleared and everyone settled into the living room, Greg turned to Jimmy with a seriousness that quieted the room. "I need to say something," he began, voice steady but emotional. "I've been hard on you, too hard. I didn't realize how my expectations affected you. I thought pushing you meant loving you, but I see now it only pushed you away." Jimmy looked down, absorbing the confession. After a moment, he lifted his gaze. "Dad, I didn't understand you either. I thought you were trying to control me. I thought you didn't trust me," he exhaled. "But you were trying to protect me. I see that now." They held each other's eyes for a long moment. Two men who had spent years misunderstanding each other finally stepping into the same truth. And then it happened. The simple, powerful moment both needed far more than they realized. "I forgive you," Jimmy said quietly. Greg swallowed hard. "I forgive you too." Their voices weren't loud, but the words seemed to settle into the room with a weight that felt cleansing. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it reshaped the future. And in that moment, they both understood that their future depended not on perfection, but on effort, honesty, and willingness. The rest of the night passed peacefully. Samantha watched the two men she loved finally lowering their guards. Rachel chatted with Jimmy about his plans. Megan offered gentle encouragement where needed. The warmth in the room felt hard-earned and deeply valued. As the evening came to an end, Greg stepped onto the porch with Jimmy, the cool air settling around them. They didn't say much, just stood side by side, the silence between them no longer heavy but comfortable. "We've still got work to do," Jimmy said softly. Greg nodded. "Yeah, but we're on the right path." The scars were still there, the wounds not fully healed. But for the first time in years, the family wasn't walking backward into old patterns. They were moving forward. Together. The night was cool when everything finally came to a head. Greg and Jimmy had been doing better, much better, yet beneath the surface, something unspoken still pulsed between them. A tension not born from anger now, but from fear. Fear of slipping back. Fear of repeating old patterns. Fear of being honest enough to uproot whatever pieces of the past still had their grip on both of them. It happened on a quiet evening at Greg's house. Jimmy had stopped by after work, the two of them sitting on the back porch with the soft hum of crickets filling the silence. They talked about simple things at first: Jimmy's job search, a place he was considering renting, the new responsibilities he was learning to navigate. But the conversation slowed, and the air thickened with the weight of something deeper neither had addressed. Jimmy broke first. "Dad," he said softly, almost cautiously, "I know we've been rebuilding things, and I'm grateful for that, but I need to be honest about something." He stared down at his hands, twisting them together. "I'm still scared." Greg Stry. GH10 taken off guard, scared of what? Of falling back into the same place we were before, of disappointing you, of getting trapped under your expectations again. Jimmy swallowed hard. Even now, when you offer help, part of me flinches, not because I don't appreciate it, but because I'm afraid I'll lose myself if I lean on you too much. The words were raw, unpolished, but truthful, and they landed like a stone in Greg's chest. For a long moment, he didn't respond, not because he was angry, but because hearing Jimmy's voice, the fear Greg had accidentally nurtured for years, forced him to confront something he'd been avoiding. Finally, with a heavy breath, Greg spoke. "Jimmy, I never realized how much pressure I put on you." His voice wavered. "I've spent your whole life trying to prevent you from making mistakes because I was terrified of losing you, terrified that if I didn't make myself useful, important, you wouldn't need me at all." Jimmy looked up, surprised. Greg continued, his tone thick with vulnerability he rarely allowed out. "I wasn't controlling you because I didn't trust you. I was controlling things because I didn't trust myself." He paused. "I thought love meant steering your life so you wouldn't get hurt, but all I did was make you feel trapped. And I'm sorry, truly." Jimmy sat still, absorbing every word with wide, softened eyes. Inside the house, Samantha had been setting dishes in the kitchen, but had lingered near the open window long enough to hear the emotional shift in their voices. She stepped outside quietly, joining them on the porch. "Both of you," she said gently, "need to understand something." She pulled up a chair. "What you're feeling, it's normal. Love isn't neat, it's messy. It has arguments, misunderstandings, hurt feelings, but also honesty, forgiveness, and new beginnings." She looked between them. "You don't heal by avoiding the hard conversations. You heal by walking through them together." Her words settled over them like a blanket, warm, grounding, steady. Jimmy exhaled shakily. "I'm trying, Mom, I really am, but some days I still feel that old defensiveness, like I'm waiting for Dad to take over again." Greg nodded, not defensive this time. "And some days I still want to step in. It's instinct, but I'm learning to let go." They stared at each other, father and son finally speaking the same emotional language. And then it happened. A breakthrough quieter than an apology, gentler than forgiveness. Jimmy leaned back and said, "Dad, I don't need you to fix everything. I just need you to be here, as my father, not as my safety net." Greg's eyes glistened, the message hitting deeper than any words Jimmy had spoken before. "And I need to learn how to do that," he whispered. "But I want to try, every day." From the porch steps, Megan appeared. She'd arrived minutes earlier and overheard just enough to understand the gravity of the moment. She offered a soft smile. "You two have come a long way," she said. "Don't stop now. Emotional growth isn't a finish line, it's a lifelong process. You don't perfect it, you practice it." She left them with that wisdom, retreating back inside to give them space. Greg turned to Jimmy again. "I'm not perfect," he said quietly. "Neither am I," Jimmy replied. They shared a silence that wasn't tense or awkward, just honest. Then Greg reached over, resting a hand on Jimmy's shoulder. Jimmy didn't pull away this time. Instead, he placed his hand over his father's, grounding the moment with simple acceptance. The emotional wall between them, years of fear, pride, expectations, and misunderstandings, didn't crumble all at once, but it cracked, deeply, meaningfully, enough for something new to grow. And in that quiet, intimate moment, both father and son understood the same truth. They didn't need to be perfect. They just needed each other. A new beginning was finally taking shape, and though the journey ahead would still require work, patience, and vulnerability, they were ready to face it side by side. In the weeks that followed their breakthrough, the air around Greg and Jimmy felt different, lighter, steadier, shaped less by tension and more by quiet determination. Jimmy had begun stepping into adulthood with a resolve Greg had never seen in him before. With the house sold and the ordeal behind him, he threw himself into rebuilding his life, this time with intention. He researched apartments, compared prices, asked thoughtful questions about leases and utilities. He met with potential employers, went on interviews, and even turned down a job that didn't feel right instead of jumping at the first offer. Every decision he made, carefully, independently, was proof of how much he had grown since the chaos that once defined their days. And Greg saw it all. What surprised him most wasn't just Jimmy's newfound independence. It was how easily Greg let him navigate it. The old urge to step in, to suggest, to correct, to guide, it wasn't gone completely, but it no longer pulled at him with the same force. Instead, he watched Jimmy's progress with quiet pride, realizing that this was what he had wanted all along, a son confident enough to stand on his own. Greg found himself changing too. Conversations with Jimmy weren't filled with lectures or instructions anymore. They were balanced, mutual, grounded in respect rather than hierarchy. And strangely, Greg didn't feel less important now that he wasn't in control. He felt more connected. Samantha watched the shift with deep relief. The tension that once lingered between Greg and Jimmy like a storm cloud had finally dispersed. She no longer needed to mediate every disagreement or soften every blow. Now, she supported from the sidelines, offering warmth rather than worry. For the first time in years, the household felt peaceful, like a wound had finally begun to heal instead of reopening every few days. One evening, Rachel visited, sensing the change the moment she stepped through the door. Greg seemed more relaxed, more emotionally present, and Jimmy carried himself with a confidence she had rarely seen. As they sat together after dinner, Rachel offered her quiet wisdom. "Dad," she said, "you've done good work, but remember, relationships don't stay healed on their own. You have to keep showing up emotionally, not just physically. It's not a one-time fix. It's ongoing." Greg nodded, absorbing the truth in her words. "I know," he said. "I'm learning." "And you're doing it well," Rachel added. "Better than you think." Her affirmation settled into him like a warm reassurance, strengthening something fragile but growing inside him. As days passed, the Hamilton family entered a new rhythm, one that didn't revolve around Greg's authority or Jimmy's resentment. Instead, they operated like equals, three adults, each carrying their share of emotional responsibility. Greg no longer felt the need to monitor Jimmy's choices, and Jimmy embraced the accountability he had avoided for so long. But the biggest transformation came inside Greg. For years, he had quietly carried guilt for being too controlling, too distant, too financial in his love. He had replayed mistakes like a tape loop, convincing himself he had failed Jimmy as a father. But now, watching Jimmy stand tall, make decisions, and move forward, Greg felt something inside him unclench. One night he sat alone on the porch, the air cool around him, and whispered to himself, "I did the best I could, and I can do better now." It wasn't an excuse. It was forgiveness, real, overdue forgiveness. For the first time, he allowed himself to let go of the narrative that he had ruined everything. He understood now that love wasn't about fixing every problem. It was about staying through every season. Later that week, Jimmy stopped by unexpectedly. They ended up in the garage, sorting through old boxes that Jimmy planned to take to his new place. As they lifted a crate together, they both paused at the same time, almost like they sensed something unspoken was settling between them. "Dad," Jimmy said quietly, "I know I messed up a lot, but I learned from it. And I'm glad we went through it, not the pain, but what it taught us." Greg swallowed, emotion tapping at the edges of his voice. "Me too. I learned a lot about myself, more than I expected." Jimmy nodded. "We're different now." Greg looked at him, truly looked, and saw not the boy he'd spent years trying to mold, but the man he had finally allowed to become himself. "Yes," Greg whispered, "we are." In that shared silence, in the weight of that simple acknowledgement, something clicked into place, something they had been reaching for all along. A moment of clarity. A moment that showed them both how far they'd come, and how much further they could go together. The Hamilton home felt different now, lighter, warmer, almost as if the walls themselves could finally breathe again. With the chaos of the past months behind them, Greg, Jimmy, and Samantha naturally drifted into conversations about the future. Not about houses or money or obligations, but about what they actually wanted their lives and their relationships to look like from here on out. On a quiet Sunday morning, the three of them sat around the breakfast table. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, painting the room in soft gold. Samantha poured coffee for everyone, and for once, the silence wasn't tense. It was comfortable, expectant. Greg cleared his throat gently. "We've been through a lot," he said, "but I don't want us to go back to who we were before. I want us to keep growing, together." Jimmy nodded slowly. "I want that too. I'm not the same guy I was when this all started. I don't want to be him again." He glanced at his father. "And I don't want our relationship to fall back into old habits." They talked for over an hour, not about finances or responsibilities, but about trust, communication, and how they could support one another without overstepping. Samantha listened with a quiet smile, knowing how rare and precious these conversations had once been. Later that afternoon, Jimmy found himself sitting alone on the back steps, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past few months. The anger, the shame, the frustration, he had felt all of it. But so had growth, awareness, and a depth of understanding he had never reached before. He replayed moments in his mind, Greg rushing to fix things, Jimmy pushing back violently, the arguments, the silence, the painful realizations. And then he replayed the reconciliation, the apologies, the vulnerability, the honesty. For the first time, Jimmy truly understood his father. Greg's control hadn't come from arrogance, it had come from fear and love tangled together. Greg had wanted to protect him, even when it came out messy and wrong. Jimmy exhaled deeply. "He wasn't trying to trap me," he murmured to himself. "He was just trying to keep me safe." And somehow that truth softened everything inside him. Inside, Greg stood by the living room window, watching Jimmy outside. But unlike before, he didn't worry. He didn't wonder what Jimmy was thinking or feel the tug to intervene. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of peace, a feeling that had been absent for years. He finally understood something he had resisted. Jimmy didn't need him to lead. Jimmy needed him to stand beside him. The realization left Greg lighter, his heart no longer clenched with guilt or the pressure to fix everything. For the first time in a long time, he felt whole. That evening, Samantha suggested a celebratory family dinner. Nothing grand, just a meal to honor how far they'd come. She cooked Jimmy's favorite dish, and when Rachel and Megan arrived, the house filled with laughter and energy that had been missing for far too long. During dinner, stories flowed naturally. Rachel teased Jimmy about his disastrous attempt at repairing a broken faucet, and Jimmy laughed at himself instead of bristling with embarrassment. Greg shared memories from Jimmy's childhood, moments he hadn't spoken of in years. Samantha chimed in with gentle humor, and the room hummed with a harmony none of them had dared hope for months earlier. Midway through the evening, Megan lifted her glass and glanced between Greg and Jimmy. "You too," she said softly, "have done something not everyone can do. You faced yourselves. You faced each other. That takes courage." She leaned back with a satisfied nod. "There's still work ahead, there always will be, but you're in a better place than I've ever seen." Her words settled into the room, grounding them all with gratitude and pride. As the night wound down, Greg looked around the table, at Samantha's warm smile, Rachel's bright eyes, Megan's steady calm, and Jimmy's relaxed posture. This, he realized, was the family he had always wanted. Not perfect, not polished, but connected. He and Jimmy caught each other's gaze across the room, silent, understanding, and full of a renewed bond neither had dared dream of. Later, after everyone left, Greg and Jimmy stepped outside. The sky was a soft navy, stars scattered across it like tiny reminders of how small and yet meaningful their struggles were. They walked side by side down the quiet street, No tension, no distance, just two men who had finally found their way back to each other. Jimmy shoved his hands in his pockets, his voice gentle. "Thanks, Dad, for everything, not just the help, but sticking with me." Greg smiled, the expression easy and genuine. "And thank you for meeting me halfway." They walked a little farther, their pace unhurried, their steps matching naturally. In that shared silence, something new took root, a legacy built not on financial support or expectations, but on emotional truth and earned respect. Their relationship had been broken, tested, and rebuilt. But now, it had been reborn. The weeks that followed felt quieter, steadier, almost unfamiliar in their peacefulness. Greg and Jimmy were learning to live inside a new dynamic, one not built on money or obligation, but on the slow, deliberate practice of mutual respect. Their conversations no longer revolved around financial decisions or crises. Instead, they talked about life, small things, everyday things, things they had never slowed down enough to share before. Jimmy felt the shift most when he no longer needed to brace himself before speaking to his father. He didn't scan Greg's face for judgment or recoil at advice. And when Greg did offer advice, it felt different, lighter, optional, rooted in support rather than control. As Jimmy explored a new chapter in his life, he began planning a small business venture, a mobile detailing service he'd dreamed about for years. Instead of dismissing it or trying to take it over, Greg asked thoughtful questions, listened, and only offered guidance when Jimmy requested it. One afternoon, they sat on Greg's porch reviewing Jimmy's rough business plan. Greg pointed out a few potential pitfalls, but instead of dictating what Jimmy should do, he simply said, "Whatever direction you choose, make sure it aligns with what you want, not what you think I want." Jimmy nodded, surprised by how empowering it felt. "I will, and thanks, Dad, for trusting me this time." Greg smiled. "You've earned it." For Greg, the new normal brought its own transformation. He often found himself drifting into reflection, thinking about the months behind them and the man he once was. He saw how his overwhelming involvement in Jimmy's life had come from fear. Fear of losing his son, fear of being irrelevant, fear of not knowing how to show emotion in ways that didn't involve money. But now, watching Jimmy take responsibility for his choices, Greg felt a new security. Their bond wasn't fragile anymore. It wasn't dependent on what he could provide financially. It was built on something real, something earned, connection. Samantha watched the transformation unfold with a peace she hadn't felt in years. The heaviness that once hovered over every family gathering had dissolved. She saw Greg becoming softer, more patient, and Jimmy growing into a man who no longer flinched at accountability. More than once, she found herself smiling quietly during dinner, grateful for the harmony that had replaced old resentments. She told Greg one evening, "You two finally learned to meet each other halfway. That's all I ever wanted." Greg kissed her forehead. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm sorry it took this long." Meanwhile, Rachel continued to play her quiet but steady role. She checked in with both men, not to fix anything but to reinforce the progress they'd made. She reminded Greg during one phone call, "Healing isn't something you achieve, it's something you maintain. Keep talking to each other. Keep choosing honesty." To Jimmy, she said, "Don't fall back into hiding your struggles. Dad can handle hearing them now." And Jimmy, surprisingly, agreed. He wasn't afraid of disappointing Greg anymore. They were building something too solid for old patterns to threaten. As the months passed, the Hamilton family found themselves together more often, something that hadn't happened in years. Sunday dinners became a tradition again. Holidays felt warmer. Conversations flowed easily. Even the silences were comfortable. During one dinner, Jimmy made everyone laugh retelling a story about spilling a full bucket of soapy water inside a customer's car on his very first detailing job. Greg laughed the loudest, and more importantly, he didn't jump in with criticism or advice. He simply enjoyed the moment, proud of the way his son handled setbacks with humor instead of shame. The emotional distance that had once felt insurmountable had all but disappeared. What remained was connection, a real one, fragile at first but now strengthened by honesty, vulnerability, and effort from both sides. One evening, after a family meal filled with laughter and warmth, Greg and Jimmy stood outside saying goodbye. They didn't need a long conversation. They just shared a quiet moment, looking out at the street, knowing without saying it that they had come a long way. Jimmy broke the silence first. "We've changed a lot," he said. Greg nodded. "We have and will keep changing, that's the point." Jimmy smiled, a genuine grounded smile. "Dad, I'm glad we made it here." "So am I," Greg replied. They exchanged a simple handshake that shifted into a brief, heartfelt embrace, the kind they once avoided out of habit. Now it felt natural. The past wasn't erased. It still lived behind them. But the future, open, steady, theirs to shape, felt brighter than anything they had imagined months earlier. And as Jimmy drove off into the night, Greg watched the taillights fade with a quiet certainty. They weren't just rebuilding a relationship. They were building a future. The Hamilton family's new chapter didn't arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. It grew quietly, almost organically, in the small routines they began to build together. Sunday dinners turned into a standing tradition, not because someone insisted, but because everyone genuinely wanted to be there. Greg found himself grilling in the backyard while Jimmy helped Samantha prepare salads or set the table. They played cards after meals, watched old movies, or simply talked about the week. These weren't material gifts or forced displays of affection. They were moments, simple, meaningful, grounding. It was during these gatherings that Jimmy's independence became most visible. He spoke differently now, with a steadiness in his voice Greg hadn't heard before. He shared decisions he'd made about his business venture, how he'd negotiated a contract, how he'd hired someone part-time, how he planned to expand next season. And the most telling part was this: he wasn't seeking Greg's approval. He was sharing out of pride, not insecurity. Greg noticed the shift with a mixture of pride and something bittersweet. He had always feared that Jimmy couldn't stand on his own without him. But now, watching his son navigate life with growing confidence, Greg realized he had been wrong, not about Jimmy's potential, but about his own role as a father. He finally understood that he didn't need to fix every problem, shield every mistake, or pave every road. Letting go wasn't abandonment, it was trust. And trust, he realized, was a more powerful expression of love than control ever could be. One evening, while Jimmy stepped inside to help Samantha with dessert, Greg lingered alone on the porch, staring into the dimming sky. Samantha joined him quietly a moment later, slipping her arm through his. "You know," she said softly, "you're doing it. You're letting him be his own man." Greg breathed out slowly. "It feels strange. Good, but strange. I spent so many years thinking I had to hold everything together." "You don't anymore," Samantha whispered. "He's growing, and you're growing too." Her words brought him comfort, more than she realized. Later that same night, after dinner dishes were done and Rachel had called to check in, Greg and Jimmy found themselves in a conversation they had avoided for years: money. The topic had always been charged between them, full of misunderstandings and buried resentment, but now felt like the right moment to clear the air. Jimmy leaned against the counter and sighed. "Dad, I want us to have something clear between us. I don't want money to ever be the thing that defines us again. I don't want it to be the reason we fight or the reason we avoid talking." Greg nodded slowly. "I agree. I used money to fill a space I didn't know how to fill emotionally, and that created damage I never saw coming." Jimmy met his eyes, calm and steady. "I don't need you to fund my life anymore. If I ever really need help, I'll tell you. But I don't want you to feel responsible for everything that goes wrong. I want to stand on my own." Greg felt a small swell of pride at the words. "And I want to support you, but emotionally, not financially. Unless you're in real trouble, and even then only if you ask. No more surprises, no more pushing. They sealed the new boundary with a quiet handshake, a symbolic gesture that carried more meaning than either expected. As weeks turned into months, the family found themselves reflecting naturally on how far they had come. Samantha often paused during dinners, watching the men she loved laugh, tease, and talk with ease, and felt a deep gratitude settle inside her. The wounds that once seemed impossible to heal were now gentle scars, reminders of the work they had done and the closeness they had built. Even Greg noticed the ease. There were no explosions waiting beneath the surface, no tension pressing down on every conversation. The distance between him and Jimmy had dissolved into something healthier, something real. Jimmy no longer flinched at advice, and Greg no longer hovered with solutions. They interacted like equals, father and son, not controller and dependent. One evening, near the end of summer, the three of them sat on the back porch as the sun dipped low. They talked about the future, not big, overwhelming plans, but small hopes. Samantha talked about wanting to travel more. Jimmy shared dreams of expanding his business. Greg simply said he wanted more evenings like this, peaceful, honest, connected. There was no resentment hidden between their words, no fear of what might go wrong, just a sense of calm, of unity, of love earned the hard way. As the sky shifted into twilight, Jimmy leaned back in his chair, exhaling contentedly. "Feels good, doesn't it?" he murmured. Greg smiled softly. "Yeah, it really does." And in that shared moment, surrounded by family, supported by vulnerability, strengthened by trust, the Hamiltons felt a truth they had long fought for. They were finally whole. The changes between Greg and Jimmy didn't arrive with fanfare. They settled in quietly, like a warm breeze drifting into an open room. Conversations flowed more naturally now. The pauses between them weren't loaded with tension but filled with understanding. Their relationship had matured, no longer swinging between conflict and avoidance, but balanced, steady, grounded in something deeper than either of them expected. They talked openly without flinching. Jimmy didn't hold back his fears or uncertainties, and Greg didn't swallow his emotions anymore. The walls that had once divided them now felt like fragile relics of a past they had outgrown. When Jimmy shared frustrations about his growing business, Greg listened, not to solve, not to steer, but to understand. And Jimmy, in turn, asked for advice when he truly needed it, not out of expectation or obligation, but trust. The shift didn't go unnoticed. Samantha saw it first, the way Greg no longer hovered, the way Jimmy no longer bristled. Their conversations were softer, their disagreements shorter, their laughter more frequent. Rachel picked up on it too when she visited one weekend. She observed the subtle warmth between them, the absence of old tension, the way Greg and Jimmy interacted as equals rather than combatants in an emotional tug-of-war. Even close friends of the family, Adam, Megan, and a few neighbors, noticed the difference. The Hamiltons no longer seemed like a family keeping up appearances. They looked like people who genuinely enjoyed being together. The facade of wealth, success, and control had been stripped away, replaced by something far more meaningful: connection. Jimmy found himself reflecting on his past more often than he expected. Sometimes it happened when he passed the old neighborhood where the house once stood. Sometimes when he revisited memories of arguments, harsh words, and immature reactions. He realized now how deeply he had misread his father's intentions, how he'd mistaken love for control, guidance for interference, fear for dominance. "Dad wasn't trying to trap me," he admitted to himself one evening while closing up his workshop. "He was just scared, the same way I was scared." That realization softened decades of resentment he had held onto, reshaping old narratives he once believed were etched in stone. The tough love he once despised had become, in hindsight, the catalyst that pushed him into adulthood. Greg, too, had undergone his own quiet evolution. For years, he had carried guilt like an anchor, guilt for being controlling, guilt for misreading Jimmy's emotional needs, guilt for creating distance instead of closeness. But now, as he watched his son flourish in independence, that guilt began to fade. Greg had finally forgiven himself. Not because he believed he'd been perfect, but because he finally understood himself. His actions had come from fear, fear of losing his son, fear of being inadequate, fear of abandonment. He couldn't rewrite the past, but he could shape the future with intention, humility, and love. One afternoon, as the three of them sat on the porch, Samantha sipping iced tea, Jimmy scrolling through his business messages, and Greg relaxing with a book, the conversation naturally shifted toward the future, not with anxiety but with genuine curiosity. They acknowledged that healing was a long journey and setbacks were inevitable. Some days would be hard. Some old wounds might resurface. But now they had the tools they'd lacked before: communication, patience, transparency. Rachel stopped by later that same day, joining them on the porch swing. Listening to them talk, she offered her insight with a soft smile. "You know," she said, "financial wounds can be patched up with time and effort, but emotional wounds, they're harder, they take longer. But when they heal," she looked between Greg and Jimmy, her eyes warm, "they create something stronger than before." The words settled into the air like a truth they all needed to hear. As the sun began to set, painting the yard in amber hues, Greg and Jimmy found themselves standing alone by the fence, looking over the lawn they had once argued about mowing. The moment was still, peaceful, almost sacred. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Jimmy gave a small nod, subtle but filled with meaning. Greg responded with a soft smile, equally subtle, equally meaningful. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of everything they had endured and everything they had rebuilt. No grand gestures, no dramatic speeches, just the quiet understanding that their bond was stronger than ever. Stronger because it had been tested. Stronger because it had been broken. Stronger because they chose to rebuild it, not out of obligation but respect. A new beginning wasn't coming. It was already here. The celebration wasn't extravagant, no lavish decorations, no expensive catering, no status-driven expectations. Instead, the Hamilton family gathered in Greg and Samantha's backyard on a mild summer evening, the sky tinged with soft gold as the sun began its descent. A string of warm lights hung across the porch, and the smell of grilled chicken and rosemary filled the air. It was simple, it was heartfelt, and it was perfect. Jimmy's success in his business venture was the official reason for the gathering, but they all knew the real celebration ran deeper. This wasn't about a house or a loan or anything tied to material wealth. It was about Jimmy's growth, his independence, his maturity, his transformation into the man he had fought so hard to become. For the first time, the applause he received was rooted not in what Greg had given him, but in what Jimmy had earned himself. As everyone enjoyed the meal, laughter mingled with the clinking of silverware. Rachel teased Jimmy about his first disastrous detailing job, and Megan raised her glass in a heartfelt toast, acknowledging the journey they had all traveled. Samantha moved around the table with a glow in her eyes, checking on everyone, smiling at every shared joke. Even Greg felt himself relax in a way he hadn't in years. After dinner, while Samantha and Rachel cleaned up, Jimmy motioned to Greg with a tilt of his head. "Walk with me for a minute." Greg agreed, following his son down the path that led to the edge of the property. The cicadas hummed, the air warm but comfortable, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, not yet. Finally, Jimmy broke the silence. "I didn't think I'd ever get here," he admitted, "not just with the business but with you." Greg's chest tightened, not with pain this time but with a tender ache of understanding. "I know," he said softly. "There were times I thought we'd never find our way back." Jimmy kicked gently at a pebble on the ground. "But we did." Greg paused, turning to face him fully. "Jimmy," he said, his voice steady but emotional, "I've always wanted what's best for you. I really believed helping you financially was the way to show that. But now I see it's about letting you become the man you need to be. Not the man I wanted you to be, and I'm proud of who you're becoming." Jimmy didn't respond immediately, but Greg could see his son's jaw tighten, his eyes soften, the look of someone holding back emotion. Then Jimmy nodded, slow and sincere. "Thank you, Dad. That means more than you know." They stood there for a long moment, not speaking, letting the weight of the past settle and fade into something lighter. Back at the house, Samantha watched them from the porch. When they returned, she wiped her eyes quickly, but not quickly enough to hide her tears. "You too," she said, her voice catching. "I can't tell you how proud I am, of both of you. If someone had told me a year ago that this is where we'd end up, I don't think I would have believed them." Greg wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Jimmy stepped closer too, letting the moment soak in, a moment that felt like a long-awaited sunrise. Megan joined them with a warm smile. "I'll say it," she announced. "It wasn't easy. None of this was, but look at you now, look at this family." She gestured around toward the yard, the house, the soft glow of the evening. "This is what healing looks like, quiet, real, hard-earned." They all nodded, knowing she was right. The Hamiltons had begun a new chapter, one not defined by power struggles or old wounds, but by mutual respect, open conversations, and a shared desire to build something better. Over the next hour they talked about the future, not in grand plans but in hopes and intentions. Greg and Jimmy no longer spoke like adversaries or wary father and son. They spoke like equals, partners in rebuilding, partners in growth. The heaviness that once overshadowed every conversation had been replaced by something steady, warm, and honest. As the evening drew to a close, the guests trickled out until only Greg and Jimmy remained outside. The sky had darkened into a deep navy, the street lamps flickering to life. Jimmy shoved his hands into his pockets, glancing down the quiet street. "Walk?" he asked. Greg nodded, and together they stepped off the driveway, their footsteps falling in sync. They walked side by side, no tension, no distance, no unspoken resentments lingering between them. Just peace. Hard-earned, fragile, beautiful peace. Greg inhaled deeply, feeling the night air settle in his chest. "You know," he said quietly, "everything we went through, it taught me something." Jimmy glanced over. "Yeah. That forgiveness, real forgiveness, is a legacy. Not just for us, but for whatever comes next, for the future, for your future family someday." Jimmy didn't reply right away, but after a moment he smiled, a quiet, grounded smile. "We're starting something new, huh?" Greg nodded. "We are." They walked a little farther, their shadows stretching across the sidewalk. The emotional turbulence that had once defined them had finally settled into understanding, into healing, into a bond reborn. Their journey wasn't over. Challenges would come. Life always guaranteed that. But now Greg and Jimmy were ready to face them together. Side by side. As father and son. As family reborn.